This is the story of a genre that set out to push things further, to make a sound without compromise or mainstream aspirations. One that would better suit the ferocity of the lyrics and image than thrash that some felt had become dangerously diluted. It ultimately ended up saving and keeping metal alive during difficult times, producing a large number of equally successful subgenres, and constantly evolving in ways no one could have ever predicted. The most successful metal album of 2024, in every way, belongs to this genre, whose story I want to tell. The story of death metal. More Sound Studios are located in Tampa, Florida, and are owned by the Morris Brothers. By the spring of 1988, the closest they had come to death metal were the demos and first album of Sabotage, as well as World Circus by the Thrashers' Toxic. But that's when their fate changed, because that's where the first death metal album in history that truly shook things up was created. And there, the following year, some truly historic classics of the genre were made. We can start with Slowly We Rot and Altars of Madness, by two bands that would become almost immediately as big and important as Death, i.e., Obituary and Morbid Angel, respectively. And then pass to the hugely influential World Downfall by Terrorizer. Imagine that Sepultura traveled from Brazil to Tampa in these very studios to record their best album to date, and possibly of their entire career, Beneath the Remains. This place will become the cradle of death metal, the second home of Death, Morbid Angel, Obituary, Deicide, and Cannibal Corpse. The only exception to the Florida rule that year was Autopsy's Severed Survival. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the great grindcore fighters were changing their skin and also joining the ranks of the new genre. Bolt Thrower, Realm of Chaos, Carcass, Symphonies of Sickness, Napalm Death, Mentally Murdered. This doesn't mean grindcore was left without material. Repulsion, Horrified, Blood, Impulse to Destroy, Macabre, Gloom. In fact, one could argue that when grindcore slows down and becomes cleaner and more technical, it gives us death metal. It's no coincidence that the three albums I mentioned above, as well as Terrorizer's World Downfall, are often labeled as death grind today, which precisely indicates the mixing of the two genres. We also had two releases that really put Central Europe into the game. The Dutch band Pestilence with Consuming Impulse, and the German band Morgoth with the EP Resurrection Absurd. We could add to them a completely unknown at the time Polish band called Vader and their demo Necrolust. 1989 was just a preview of what was to come in 1990. One could say that this was the year death metal exploded. The albums released that year were one more classic than the next. Just think about it. Of course, perhaps the most classic and the most characteristic album of all that year, dare I say the best, didn't come from Tampa, nor from mainland Europe, but from Sweden. The former Nihilist, now known as Entombed, gave us Left Hand Path, a masterfully crafted death metal album that launched a huge career for the band. Over the course of this career, they changed their sound, invented a musical genre, and helped put Sweden firmly on the map of our story. But that wasn't all. While we hadn't even fully digested this new style, the first variations began to appear. A band from Florida, Atheist, released Piece of Time, which sounded different from anything the scene had produced in its very short history. More compact, cleaner, and most importantly, highly technical and complex, with rhythmic changes and unusual time signatures. It was so different that it would inaugurate the first subgenre of death metal, technical death metal. At the same time, two other releases, Paradise Lost's Lost Paradise and Tiamat's Sumerian Cry, took a different path, a slow-paced death metal style that owes as much to Candlemass as it does to Slayer. The name was ready here too. Death Doom Metal. Entering 1991, things seemed to be getting even more serious. The bands were ready to continue and build on the momentum they had already gained. Carcass, Entombed, Autopsy, Atheist, Morbid Angel, Bolt Thrower, Pestilence, Morgoth, and Cannibal Corpse were maintaining their status and/or evolving their sound. We also had new names appearing on the horizon. Immolation with Dawn of Possession, Asphyx with The Rack, Malevolent Creation with The 10 Commandments, Unleashed with Where No Life Dwells, Gorguts with Considered Dead, Grave with Into the Grave, Massacre with From Beyond, Therion with Of Darkness. Those who have followed the scene know that some of the previous bands will be mentioned again in the future. We also had two names that had played a role in the invention of the genre, making their choice, leaving behind both thrash and black metal, and joining the new scene themselves. Sarcophago with The Laws of Scourge, and Messiah with Choir of Horrors. And finally, we had three albums that I must mention separately. The American band Suffocation will release Effigy of the Forgotten, an album that, even by death metal standards, sounded so violent, brutal, and extreme that it was given a new name, brutal death metal. Of course, how do you call a genre brutal when it's supposed to be brutal from its inception? Isn't that a bit redundant? Anyway, I think that today we all know what the term means. The Swedish band Dismember will release the album Like an Ever-Flowing Stream, which not only follows in the footsteps of Entombed, but also lays the groundwork for what would later become the most commercially successful death metal subgenre worldwide. This chapter ends with the pioneers, those who set the standard for everything. Chuck Schuldinger's Death, after the somewhat more restrained spiritual healing, give us their masterpiece. The album that is still remembered today as the best of their career and possibly the best of the entire genre we're examining in this video. Still having a lot of classic sound in the album's veins, this is where the band starts experimenting with the progressive sound, which will begin to dominate their subsequent releases. The balance that Death achieves on Human will rarely be approached in the future and will likely never be surpassed by anyone. The golden age of death metal is a bit strange. It is defined more by sales, by the attention the scene received, by the position it took in the global metal firmament, and less by the quality of the albums that were released. Obviously, I'm not saying the albums that came out in these 4 years were bad, quite the opposite. But perhaps those of the previous 3 were a notch higher. So what happened during those 4 years? Thrash unexpectedly collapsed, so someone had to take its place. In previous years, death metal had begun to gain fans from those who considered thrash too soft and mainstream. But now that there was a real void, it was the right time to turn the metal world's attention entirely towards it. Just imagine, Death and Morbid Angel having music videos on MTV, Cannibal Corpse appearing in a mainstream film and being referred to as the favorite band of Jim Carrey, Deicide surpassing 100,000 copies in the US, Entombed combining death metal with hard rock. We're talking about crazy stuff. To be fair, though, death metal never went mainstream like thrash, never achieved gold and platinum records. It simply gathered a large enough critical mass of fans to be able to say it reached global success, consistently putting out excellent material even during the darkest days for other metal genres. And in fact, it sold well and had a response from people everywhere, not just in mainland Europe or Latin America like other metal genres. But let's take a detailed look at exactly what happened during this golden age. Initially, those who had been prominent in the previous 3 years continued to be so now. Some bands maintained their momentum. Death, Suffocation, Bolt Thrower, Obituary, Cannibal Corpse, Deicide, Asphyx, Benediction, Malevolent Creation, all released very significant albums during that 3 year period, fully establishing their status. Some entered the scene even more powerfully, growing their names. Significant examples include Incantation, Unleashed, Grave, and Napalm Death as a death metal band now, while others began to change their style, going down unknown and uncharted paths. With Elements, atheists frequently crossed the border between technical death metal and pure progressive metal, as did Pestilence with Spheres. With Heartwork, Carcass began to incorporate melody into their riffs and solos, as well as elements from more traditional metal genres, paving the way for things that would happen very soon in Sweden. Finally, Entombed with Wolverine Blues took the risk of combining death metal brutality with very simple and clear structures that came directly from past hard rock heavy metal, creating a new subgenre of death metal called death and roll. Of course, the developments didn't stop there. The death grind genre, which had seen a primitive form of itself in Terrorizer's world downfall, had its official beginning with Brutal Truth's Extreme Conditions Demand Extreme Responses. At the same time, a number of new names were appearing on the horizon. Cryptopsy from Montreal with their pure, brutal death metal. The more classic demigod, Brutality, Sinister, Sadist, the former Thrasher Solstice, a band from Poland called Vader, and also my fellow Greeks, Septic Flesh. Also, some people forget that the first album of the future industrial metal legends, Fear Factory, was more or less death metal with some weird influences. As for the melodic part of the sound, we saw, in addition to Carcass, the Finnish band Amorphous, the Swedish band Edge of Sanity, but also there, at the time, relatively unknown compatriots At the Gates. This would change very shortly. Finally, there are two albums that were so unique that they took a very long time to get a successor. The one, 15 years, and the other we are still waiting for, and which deserve a separate mention. The first one is Focus by Cynic. Here, the boundaries of technical death metal are stretched so far that we practically don't know if it's death metal or progressive metal. We're talking about a mix of typical death metal passages with parts that sound suspiciously like jazz fusion, as well as a combination of the classic guttural death metal vocals with clean and/or weird robotic ones. Everything is played on a level of intense technicality by the 50% of Death's human lineup, combined with abstract existential lyrics. The second is Nespithe by the Finnish band Demolich. Although death metal has always been a particularly bold genre and never achieved massive commercial success until then, by 1993 it had built a sufficiently typical and safe sound that had never been associated with what we would call the avant-garde. It would start with this album. We're talking about a very special case. Dissonance, strange soundscapes, abrupt tempo changes, something beyond just technical. And of course, on top of all that, the most guttural vocals you've ever heard. It's like a mutated alien gargling with toxic waste while swallowing razor blades. The golden age of the classic sound didn't end abruptly or suddenly, nor was it accompanied by a collapse, like in the case of thrash. It just kind of fizzled out. The big names of the previous period continued to produce new albums and dominate the global metal scene, but everyone, musicians and audiences alike, always returned to the legendary classics. The death of Chuck Schuldiner in 2001 marked the end of an era. Although on their last album ever released, Death had almost completely transitioned to the progressive sound. Of course, the main reason the classical sound somewhat declined is that, as often happens with musical genres, it was simply replaced by something else. On November 14, 1995, at the end of the previous period we examined, an album was released by a Swedish band that we briefly mentioned in the previous chapter. It was, of course, At the Gates' Slaughter of the Soul, a sound that had been brewing behind the scenes for the last 3 to 4 years, through bands like Dismember, Carcass, Amorphous, Edge of Sanity, and At the Gates themselves, had now been perfectly crystallized. The aggression of death metal is combined with the melody in riffs and solos of classic heavy metal, creating a sound that is simpler, more crisp, and clearly more user-friendly. The amazing thing is that at that exact time, 4 bands from the same city in Sweden were releasing excellent albums with a similar sound. The city was Gothenburg, and the bands besides At the Gates were Dark Tranquillity, who released The Gallery 15 days after their compatriots In Flames, who put out The Gesture Race 2 months later, and the somewhat overlooked Sacrilege, who a year after In Flames gave us the excellent The Fifth Season. And because journalists really like coincidences and similarities, they gave the scene the obvious name, the Gothenburg Sound. But this sound very quickly spread beyond the city limits and expanded throughout Sweden. With Arch Enemy from Halmstad, Soilwork from Helsingborg, the more thrashy The Haunted, who were also from the birthplace of the sound, as they emerged from the dissolution of At the Gates, the more epic Amon Amarth from Stockholm, the already veteran Hypocrisy from Ludvika, who had completed their transition to the new sound by their 1999 self-titled album, and of course the pioneers and originators Edge of Sanity from Finspång, who, after helping to build the sound, would give us their masterpiece, Crimson, in 1996, which of course had a strong progressive tone. The aforementioned Finnish band, Amorphous, who were very close to the whole scene, albeit not Swedish, were soon joined by their compatriots, Omnium Gatherum, and most importantly, the initially more power metal-oriented Children of Bottom, whose future success would rival that of the original Swedes. The genre immediately began to gain success and attract the attention of the metal audience. Soon, many of the names we mentioned above were selling hundreds of thousands of copies of their albums worldwide and participating in major tours and festivals. The term Gothenburg sound will be replaced by the more general melodic death metal, which is often shortened to the even catchier melodeath. It was clear that at the turn of the century that this was one of the hottest metal genres worldwide. And for the traditional metalheads, the logical counterweight to the much disliked nu metal or the very hated post-grunge. The genre had a huge success in America, a fact that will have various consequences. The most significant of these was the influence it had on the then newly formed genre of metalcore, which, from 2002 to 2003 onward, began to gain immense popularity, initially across the Atlantic and subsequently worldwide. The influence of melodeath on many bands of that scene is clear. For example, Shadows Fall, Himsa, Bleeding Through, and Darkest Hour. Logically, American bands that we can consider part of the scene will also appear, such as Arsis from Virginia, Garden of Shadows from Maryland, and most importantly, of course, the Black Dahlia Murder from Detroit, one of the most successful bands in the U.S. extreme metal scene over the last 25 years. Melodic death metal will lose some of its momentum over the years due to the stylistic changes of some of its key names. I'm thinking of In Flames' shift to nu metal at a time when it was declining. but it will always remain an extremely dynamic scene that continues to produce very important names to this day. From metalcore, another scene will emerge, which I believe should be mentioned in our history, although it probably remains difficult to accept for many genre purists. On March 19, 2002, a band from Massachusetts, United States called The Red Chord released the album Fused Together in Revolving Doors, introducing a sound that directly, and not just as an influence, combines death metal with hardcore. Although this sound had likely been experimented with by others before, the coupling here was done so convincingly and completely that this album is often referred to as the official beginning of the genre that would be called deathcore. A genre that, in the years to come, and perhaps without anyone expecting it, due to the intensity of the music, would achieve great success and recognition, again primarily in America where most of its names originate. Just look at these names. Job for a Cowboy, early in their career. Fit for an Autopsy, Animosity, Whitechapel, The Contortionist, Acacia Strain, Carnifex, All Shall Perish, Despised Icon, Veil of Maya, Born of Osiris, Within the Ruins, and later Lorna Shore, Chelsea Grin, Shadow of Intent, and Humanity's Last Breath. The amazing thing is that apart from two, the Canadian band Despised Icon and the Swedish band Humanity's Last Breath, all the previous bands are American. At the same time, the fact that many of the aforementioned bands have often or still tread other paths, e.g. gent, pure metalcore, alternative, etc. But also the way the scene evolved and became known makes many people question its validity and attribute its success to the media and what the English-speaking world calls hype. If you want a purely personal opinion to attract modern generations, you need modern things, regardless of where they come from. Within these 15 years, I still believe we need to highlight some special cases of bands. Starting practically with their 1998 album, My Arms, Your Hearse, the Swedish band Opeth took a huge risk by directly combining 70s progressive rock with early 90s classic death metal, creating an amalgamation where you would find brutal death metal playing and growled vocals combined with acoustic guitars, keyboards, and clean vocals in the same song. They released a series of albums of exceptional quality, achieved massive success worldwide, with their leader, Mikael Åkerfeldt, becoming one of the most recognizable figures in the modern general progressive sound, and not just the metal part. On June 23, 1998, the Franco-Canadian band Gorguts released Obscura, taking the baton 5 years after Demilich, a dense, difficult, extremely technical album but also uniquely dissonant, with incredible changes in rhythm and musical meter, using chromatic, pentatonic, and whole tone scales in a way that you'd have to go to jazz to find, if you can find it at all. With influences ranging from noise rock to Miles Davis's modal jazz, it would be successively labeled avant-garde metal, technical death metal, and with the original term dissonant death metal. It was even more impressive than Nespeth 5 years earlier, and likely inspired all the weird death metal that has been released since then. Finally, on April 28, 1998, a band from South Carolina called Nile released an album with the strange name Amongst the Catacombs of Nefren Ka, which included songs with titles like Bara Ed Nazu or Kuduru Maklu. On this album, bandleader Carl Sanders channels his fascination with ancient Egypt through extremely technical yet brutal death metal that has no problem suddenly shifting into completely ethnic Oriental passages that seem to have fallen off a Dead Can Dance album. This unique style has brought the band a highly successful career, in which my compatriot George Colias has been participating since 2004. And since I mentioned my country, within the 15-year period we are examining, Septic Flesh rose to global prominence, to the point of being considered the main companions of Rotting Christ in the global recognition of the Greek metal scene. Albums like Ophidian Wheel, Sumerian Demons, and Communion are rightfully considered cornerstones of the entire global death metal landscape, not just the Greek one. Toward the end of the decade, another album of global significance was released in my country, the excellent Graves of the Archangels by Dead Congregation. Amidst all these new sounds, was there room for the classic death metal to make its mark? Of course there was. There was an unholy trinity of masterpieces from bands we've already seen in our story, and there, at the change of the century, seemed to have a devilish, literally and metaphorically, inspiration. I'm talking about Immolation and their 2000 album Close to a World Below, Incantation with their 1998 album Diabolical Conquest, and Vader with their 1996 album De Profundis, and probably also their 2001 Litany. Before I start talking about the modern death metal scene, I think I should open a parenthesis and talk about the weird death metal. The strange, unusual, avant-garde part of the death metal scene was generally never as developed as its black metal counterpart. I honestly don't know why, as the two scenes have many common characteristics. However, toward the end of the previous era, and just before the beginning of the one we are examining, two very important names emerged who wanted to venture down very unique paths, making a big impression on the metal scene at the time, with people talking about the death metal of the future. I'm talking about the Australian band Portal and their 2007 album Outre, as well as their neighbors, the New Zealand band Ulcerate, with their 2009 album Everything is Fire. The Aussies proposed a relentless, endlessly cyclical, and claustrophobic death metal that pushes the listener to a wall and doesn't let them breathe. A truly terrifying death metal sound on every level. In fact, the Australian band had, and still has, a very distinctive image which further intensifies the closed and mysterious nature of their music. As for the New Zealanders, they also have a very distinctive sound that seems to owe as much to Gorguts as it does to Morbid Angel, combined with a clear influence from the sludge scene and bands like Neurosis, which makes their sound even more modern and avant-garde. So it's an opportunity to talk about the history of weird death metal. Beyond the aforementioned Atheist, Demilich, Gorguts, and Cynic, there were also a number of other bands and releases that dared to push things a little further in the genre's history. The American, also from Florida, band Nocturnus, in their 1990 album, The Key, incorporated keyboards, sometimes cinematic, sometimes atmospheric, and sometimes just plain crazy. If you think something like that was simple in the death metal scene of 1990, you probably didn't live through that era. In their 1992 album, Not to Be Undimensional Conscious, the Austrian band Disharmonic Orchestra displayed an artistic aesthetic and experimentation that seemed to have nothing to do with the blood and fire of other death metal bands. Musically, however, they were sufficiently brutal, at times following in the footsteps of Atheist, while also glancing a bit towards Faith No More. Dan Suwano's Panthemonium took things to another extreme on their 1996 album Chaos and Confusion. Schizophrenically progressive metal that was on par with Mr. Bungle in the number of different styles the band can switch between within a song. Just swap the Californians' funk and ska for heavily distorted guitars and brutal death metal vocals, and you can get an idea of what they sound like. The Czech band Lycothea Aflame, with their magnum opus Elvenifris from 2000, took the Nile model and added elements like prog, grindcore, electronic, and gothic, which at first glance might seem chaotically placed, but in reality are very carefully arranged, giving the result a more multifaceted and diverse dimension compared to Carl Sanders' band. It's a shame this was their only album. The German band Necrophagist gave us a death metal variant that, while not as crazy as those of the previous bands, presents certain peculiarities that place it in the same category. They started in 1999 with a preference for very gory lyrics reminiscent of Carcass, combined with an incredibly technical playing in every aspect, with special mention going to the amazing drumming. In their 2004 album, Epitaph, what makes them stand out was clearly evident: the obsession of their guitarist and leader, Mohammed Suismis, with Yngwie J. Malmsteen and neoclassical metal, giving us the first, and perhaps only, example of what we would call super technical neoclassical death metal. Finally, the English band Akerkaka will give us their own experimental magnum opus with their 2005 album, Words That Go Unspoken, Deeds That Go Undone. The combination of death metal, black metal, post-punk, and progressive rock, with shrill, clean, and brutal vocals and extremely blasphemous and sexual lyrics, is absolutely unique and unparalleled in the genre, and sounds incredibly fresh, even today. Now let's close the parenthesis and return to our story. The world of death metal was somewhat different after Portal and Ulcerate, and I would say more daring. So, in the era we're examining, we saw the emergence of many bands that would take significant risks and achieve success precisely by relying on those risks. New York's Pyron continued in the tradition of Gorguts, along with Italy's Ad Nauseam and their compatriots' Artificial Brain. The New Yorkers' Imperial Triumphant also made a strong impression with a blend of death metal and black metal, combined with jazz prog soundscapes. Californian band Cattle Decapitation truly entered the death metal radar when they shifted from the typical gore grind they were playing to a more rational death grind that was based on early Carcass, with their 2012 album Monolith of Inhumanity. Rivers of Nihil from Pennsylvania gave us an excellent blend of technical death metal, progressive metal, and jazz fusion with their 2018 album Where Owls Know My Name, on some tracks, of which we can clearly hear the sound of the saxophone. Of course, as we mentioned earlier, the leaders of all this are Blood Incantation from Denver, who had no problem transitioning from the classic Morbid Angel sound to that of Eloy within the same song in such a convincing way that one wonders why no one else had thought of that before. Their latest album, which we discussed at the beginning of the video, features members of Tangerine Dream, a krautrock giant that no one would ever think to associate with death metal. Now you'll tell me, what about the other subgenres of death metal? Did they back down now that so many people are looking for experimentation? Well, I wouldn't say that. In the classic sound, we can mention, for example, the Chilean band Inanna, Horrendous from South Carolina, the English bands Sludge and Grave Miasma, the Spanish band Titan Blood, and the Canadian bands Tomb Mold and Mitochondrion. Before the protests start, I know that some of the previous bands also touch on other neighboring genres. For example, Horrendous on technical death metal and Titan Blood on war metal. The case of the Polish band Behemoth is very special. They started as a typical black metal band, but over time they clearly shifted towards death metal, achieving huge global success with their 2014 album, The Satanist, which reached number 34 on the Billboard chart in America. A characteristic of the band is their consistently strong anti-religious stance, which is reminiscent of other eras of the metal scene. Regarding the melodic death metal scene, during the period we are examining, the Swedish band, Scar Symmetry, achieved significant success, while the veteran Finnish band Insomnium, whom I could have mentioned in my initial reference to the style, continue to produce excellent work. Other names that stand out are the Danish band Iotun, the Australian band Bellacore, and the also Swedish band In Mourning. In the special cases, we should include Gatecreeper from Phoenix, Arizona, who blend their melodic death metal with elements of early Paradise Lost, giving us a very vibrant amalgamation that I consider a contender for great things in the future. As well as the crazy Germans Kannonenfieber, who play a melodic death metal that nods towards black metal, have lyrics in German, a very distinctive image that extends to the aesthetics of their album covers, and an obvious obsession with World War I. A special mention should also be made to Brat from New Orleans, who combine death metal, death grind, groove metal, and deathcore, have members who look like they've stepped out of a cartoon, a female vocalist, and a series of impressive music videos on YouTube. Finally, and in closing, I would like to mention, primarily as a curiosity, two new subgenres that have emerged in recent years and which I discovered almost by chance. One is slam death metal, which, as its name suggests, combines typical death metal elements with slow or mid-tempo breakdown sections built on chromatic, palm-muted riffs, known as slams. The genre seems to have existed since the 90s, although it has definitely gained momentum in recent years. In its modern form, it is almost exclusively associated with extreme brutal death metal, with the Texan band Devourment as its main exponents and pioneers. The other is down-tempo deathcore, which we could describe as a slow and minimalist sound based on distorted guitars, atmosphere, and breakdowns. Practically, it's alternative atmospheric deathcore. Notable representatives of the genre include the British band Black Tongue and the American band The Last 10 Seconds of Life, while the aforementioned deathcore bands Humanity's Last Breath and the Acacia Strain have also made a turn towards this sound. All the things I mentioned in this chapter show a genre in constant evolution and turmoil that persists, even if that means it has to shed its skin a little. I think the current situation, where extreme sound seems to be very popular with the young crowd, favors it. One thing is for sure, though, we'll be talking about it for many years to come.